We're going to start the second half of our conversation with William Frey, and again, here's his book, Diversity Explosion. Highly recommend it to you. For those of you that missed the opening segment, what we've done at this point is talk about the really amazing statistical findings in the book and the way Bill has taken these findings and woven them into really a mosaic of where our country is today and where our country's headed. As we were just finishing the last segment, we started to talk, or Bill started to talk about this tension that is probably hopefully a temporary tension, but a tension between grays and browns as it's been defined. So we're going to spend the next few moments taking the story he's written and trying to look at the political layer to the story. So please join us for the second segment. Bill, welcome back.
Sure, it's good to be here.
It's always awkward to say welcome back when you haven't changed your chair and I haven't changed my chair, but we're both back. So you were alluding to this this potential tension that, if dealt with properly, doesn't have to be a tension at all. It could be a great victory. And I think in your book you referenced a gentleman, Ron Brownstein, calls this a battle between the gray and the brown.
Yes, that's right. I use another term that means sort of the same thing. I call it the cultural generation gap. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that a lot of people my age, an older baby boomer that grew up in the 1950s and 1960s, maybe have a little bit of a hard time seeing all this change and diversity in the new young America today. Some of the polls that were done by the Pew Research Center show, for example, that more than half of the seniors and baby boomers in this country think that the newcomers from other lands are a threat to American values, a threat to American customs. They're less likely to be able to support government programs, big government programs that have, benefit any of these younger folks. Maybe they're interested in expanding Social Security or Medicare for themselves, but not so much for this younger population. They don't have an easy time recognizing the value of these younger people. And I can understand that in a way. I'm an older baby boomer, as I say. And when I was growing up back in the 50s and the 1960s, there weren't many immigrants in the United States, unless you lived in New York or Los Angeles or Miami or someplace like that. Most of my neighbors were native-born whites, and if there were immigrants around, there may be third or fourth generation of immigrants who came at the turn of the previous century. The biggest racial minority group in the United States back then were African Americans, and they were living in very segregated neighborhoods far away from where most white people lived in the United States. So this is the environment people like my age grew up in. They were baby boomers. They reached out a lot in good ways during the 1960s for women's rights and lots of things like that. But as they've gotten older, there's a high segment of the older population just has a hard time dealing with all this change. It's something that's not familiar with them. It's not their children or their grandchildren that they see in the local schools or who would be the beneficiaries, a lot of this government support. So I think that this is turned into a political thing as well, because a lot of politicians want to make political hay out of all of this. They want to use this as a wedge issue. One of the lightning rod issues is immigration in the United States. By the way, I make a point in the book that immigration no longer is responsible for most of the growth in our racial minority population in the U.S. It's not even responsible for most of the growth in the Hispanic population in the United States. That's to births and natural increase to Hispanics who are already here. So this immigration is kind of a red herring, I think, in terms of, but it's a highly symbolic thing. So you see lots of politicians wanting to put a fence on the border, the southern border of the United States, or very stringent immigration laws, and that's kind of a symbol, perhaps, to a lot of the older people that, okay, we're trying to fence away all of this change in the United States. Well, it's too late. This is where we're becoming, and as I mentioned in the earlier interview, it's a good thing because we're having an aging population. If it wouldn't be for these younger minorities, we would be facing a stark future, and if we invest rightly in them and largely in them, we're going to be doing very well. So it's this gray and the brown, as Ron Brownstein talks it, or the cultural generation gap, as I write about. This is something that's very real. We see it in elections. We're going to see it in the presidential debates that we're going to come around over the next year. You can watch the Republican debates and get a very different view of what America is than when you watch the Democratic debates. I hope that's not true, but I must think that if past is any prologue, we're going to see a different view of America from each of those two debates. And maybe I'll be wrong, and I hope I am.
Well, to a certain extent, I think people believe, and it's probably true, that they're playing to different audiences right now, and that maybe the Republicans are playing a little harder to the gray at this point in order to help maintain at least what their political base at the current time before they transition to whatever their new base becomes.
Yeah, I think one strategy for Republicans is to just playing that same card election after election after election. It's worked in the past, at least up before 2008, when we had a Democrat and an African American president get elected, and then 2 elections in a row. You know, it's what they know. It's worked for them in midterm elections. It's worked for them sometimes in local elections. And, you know, they don't seem to see the handwriting on the wall about the changing diversity in this country. I always say that if Mitt Romney would have read my book, he might be president today, because he might have gone out and tried to bake a little bit more of an openness to the minority population. He got more white Republican votes in terms of margin than any presidential candidate on the Republican side since Ronald Reagan in 1984, and he still lost. And why did he lose? Because there was a very large minority support behind Barack Obama and the Democrats.
And I think the Republicans have seen those numbers, but right now, and I don't know how much you've studied this, you know, the Republicans drew some really good maps based off that census, and they're living off those maps. And I think it's to their interest, if I was their strategist, to at least work that map as long as I could and hope that I can duplicate that in 2022.
Well, you know, the maps, I think, are okay when it comes to congressional elections,
right,
and local
right.
elections. Rural areas, outer suburban areas, small town areas are still a lot whiter. They're a lot older. But very soon, I hate to say it, those are the places that are going to show the biggest declines in their white population, not only through outmigration, but eventually through mortality. You know, in the last 3 years in a row, there are more whites in the U.S. have died than were born. And that's a traction that's going to continue into the future. And the places that are going to bear the biggest brunt of those changes are going to be these now declining parts of the country. So, you know, that's not going to happen immediately, of course. And so a couple more election cycles, you're going to be able to get away with it. But what I'm hopeful is that the Democrats can help make the case to even those voters that the only way they're going to have a good Social Security program, which they should be interested in, and the only way they're going to have a Medicare program that's going to work for them, is that if we have a well-talented, productive labor force in the future contributing to those programs. And that means investing in the younger generation. That's a message that doesn't just say, let's be good to these younger people because they're new Americans, but that it's in your self-interest to make sure that they have what it needs to take to make a success of themselves in the United States. I think that's a message that needs to get out there. I think it's an easy message to make. It doesn't take too much. I mean, you can find it in my book, you can find it in a lot of other places of why this is important. And I think there are too many politicians who know this, but they still want to play that old political game. And it may work for a couple more election cycles, but the demography, that force of demography, is eventually going to change that for them.
Now, one thing, I don't know if you've studied this, but it's an interest of mine, and I'm fascinated to see how it's going to play out in 2022, is a potential tension in redistricting among maybe black and Hispanic populations. My political base is back in Illinois, and in the last election, I think Illinois lost 1 congressional seat. Now, the Hispanic population increased in Illinois, but they lost a seat, but the Hispanics still only have arguably 1 Hispanic seat. Now, when you get to 2022, the Hispanics are going to say, wait a minute, we're probably entitled to 2 or 3 congressional seats based upon our population. But at that point in time, the blacks may be saying, I don't know how many seats they control now, 7 or 8. They may say, yeah, but we want to still have the same 7 or 8 we have now, and the whites want the same 7 or 8 they have. I see there's like this galactic clash over redistricting based upon each population either wanting to maintain what they have or the Hispanics wanting to gain what they haven't been given in the past.
Well, it may very well work out that way. You know, one thing as an aside, not nearly as many Hispanics turn out to vote as can vote. And I think that's something that's going to change over time as they see that their interest is going to be magnified if they're able to do that. Blacks do a better job of turning out than Hispanics do. But, you know, I also think that there's a convergence of interests in the Hispanic population and the black population that may be different than is the case for the older white population. And in many cases, they may find that they can swallow hard and vote. A black person could vote for a Hispanic and vice versa, knowing that some of those interests are still going to be maintained for them. The demography is on the side of the Hispanics, by the way, in terms of growth over time. But I do think there'll be convergences of interests in those groups that may not play out as divisively as you may think.
Well, I hope it's not divisive, and well, to a certain extent, I don't mind divisive when it's positive divisive. You know, it's like a fight to how we could do better, as opposed to a fight to how we tear each other down. There's two ways that fight can play out.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes identity politics maybe is not productive. It's more, what are the issues that you really have to be dealing with?
Now, the issue, the political flavor of the month seems to be not political, income inequality. And how do you layer that on the statistics as we've just talked about, and then how do you layer that on the political system?
Well, income inequality is something that has been in the news now for 4 or 5 years, especially in the aftermath of the Great Recession, as we see, especially the less well-off, less skilled people in the U.S. Doing worse, and the better off continuing to sort of hold their own, or maybe even get a little better over time. I think the increasing participation of minority groups in the U.S., new minorities, Hispanics, and Asians, and also the continued participation of African Americans, again, will change the message that needs to be given to be able to get the votes of these people. I mean, it's quite true that if the next generation of Hispanics has the same level of income and the same level of education as their parents do, that will help to make income inequality even wider than it is today. But I think people are going to realize it. I think they're going to realize it. And I think that's going to help to change some of the policies we have in the country. And so I think the racial prism on top of the income inequality prism may actually, from a political standpoint, lead to policies that may help to reduce some of the inequality that we see in the U.S. But it's a tough fight. I mean, income inequality is very stark in this country. And I'm not saying this is going to happen next year or 2 years from now, but 10, 15 years from now, as the demography changes in this country, when we have Hispanic, Asian, and African American voters, but also people who are in office from those backgrounds and in positions of responsibility, not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector, you'll see different kinds of decisions being made than we've seen the last 20 or 30 years.
Now, in your book and in our conversations on my show today, we've probably focused more on the race side of the demographics and on the race side of the political implications. In 2016, it's very likely at this point that the Democrats will have a woman candidate in the person of Hillary Clinton. Have you studied any of the sex cell voting aspects of demographics to suggest how that plays out?
Well, not per se, but I think it's interesting that we have at least the potential on the Democratic side of an older white woman running perhaps on the Republican side of a younger Latino man, perhaps Marco Rubio.
Right.
Where the standard bearer for each party is exactly the opposite of the base, okay, that they want to have, because the Democratic base is increasingly younger, highly educated minority, and the Republican base, of course, is older and whiter. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that plays out. I think Hillary perhaps might not quite have the strong enthusiasm among maybe the African American community that Barack Obama had. She'll certainly get their votes, but this huge turnout that came out for Barack Obama, the first African American candidate, viable candidate for the presidency of the United States, may be rescinded just a little bit for somebody like Hillary Clinton. So she may then rely on the fact that she'll be getting more women's votes, both white and minority, to make up for that a bit. It'll be interesting to see. And it'll be interesting to see to what degree people who voted for Republicans among the white population, perhaps college-educated white folks, who sometimes are inclined to vote for Democrats, may decide to vote more for Hillary Clinton, at least women among that group.
You know, when we were ending the last segment, I asked you if you'd do an addendum, in the middle of the 10-year period here. I'm thinking next year, if you end up with Hillary Clinton versus Rubio, you definitely have to get a new book out in a hurry, and it'll definitely be a bestseller before the election comes.
Well, the book in a hurry is not something I'm looking forward to after writing this one, but, I guess if the incentive is there, I might try it.
Well, do you have one more in you? At least you have the 2020 census for another book?
That's pretty far down the road, but ask me in 2020 and I'll let you know.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to get you back on the show before 2020. You're a terrific guest and terrific book. And I just, as I said earlier, I've fallen in love with demographics. I can't get enough of it. Thank you.
Okay, I enjoyed it a lot.